All right, good morning and welcome back. That was a wonderful presentation by Russ. Thank you so much for setting the stage of what was known about this region before the expedition of 1820 by Lewis Cass and party. One of the things that led me to creating this exhibit itself, some people have asked me, so why did you come up with the idea of doing this exhibit about the expedition? And what was happening was I was doing research about various aspects of early history of the state of Michigan, the formation of the state of Michigan, and some of the individuals involved. And they all seem to be converging back on that expedition date. All these people seem to be connected to some way, or it all kind of starts there. And that's because of these two individuals, Lewis Cass and Henry Schoolcraft, who were so important to the formation of the state of Michigan, who met as a part of this expedition, and I'll explain that a little bit more. I'm going to read my presentation, but I will occasionally go off the page, but I've got a lot I want to say, so. Over the past decade, there has been an increasing debate in the United States about what it means to be a hero. Some individuals, much heralded by previous generations for their great achievements and contributions to society, are now looked at from a more critical perspective, challenging what it means to be a great man or woman. Statues and monuments to these individuals in some cases have literally been toppled or their names removed from buildings once named in their honor. Right here on the campus of NMU, we recently removed the name of Dr. Luther S. West from the Science Building after his decades of educational achievement at the university were tainted by his unapologetic embrace of the theory of eugenics. Such reckonings in any society are difficult at times to weather, for they create a wedge between traditionalists and progressives, where certain values such as strength or conviction, courage, bravery, and intelligence always should be celebrated. Personal beliefs and antiquated views of society, reinforcing racist, sexist, and homophobic ideals are no longer glossed over in the burnishing of their reputations. So it brings the question, who should we build statues of or create monuments to celebrate if everyone is fallible and imperfect? How will future generations view the heroes that our generation lionizes? Should we lionize anyone at all? Are such monuments themselves a form of hero worship that is long past its expiration date? And this is the statue of Robert E. Lee that was recently removed from view in Richmond, Virginia. Honestly, I just want to say there was a lot of discussion whether it should be removed, what they should do with it. I felt they should have left it exactly like this, to tell the story not only of how it was created, but what happened. I personally felt this would have been a more fitting tribute than it being removed. Lewis Cass and Henry Schoolcraft are perfect examples of such individuals who were once much admired by people across the state of Michigan and beyond, but whose reputations have been tarnished by their own attitudes and actions, which are now seen as out of step with a pluralistic and inclusive society. Counties, cities, streets, lakes, buildings, and schools bear both their names. But in some cases, these designations are now being called into question. Some believe that this is the beginning of erasing their names from public memory, while others believe that it is a reckoning that is long overdue, and that where their memory will continue, we should not be honoring men who obviously were flawed and out of touch with their current social views. The question, of course, is what did both of these men achieve, and why are their achievements now being called into question? In truth, the idea of the Beaumier Center's current exhibition on the 1820 expedition of Cass originated in my own research on he and Schoolcraft and their legacies on the state of Michigan. What I have found is that all roads led back to that expedition, as it was that which brought these two individuals together and began a long mentorship between the older Cass and the ambitious Schoolcraft. Now, we'll begin with Lewis Cass, who in many ways epitomizes the American dream of ascent to greatness, well, almost. That is because he did not succeed in his quest for that highest position of President of the United States, but more on that later. The son of a Revolutionary War hero, Lewis Cass was highly motivated to make his own mark on the country. He was born in Exeter, New Hampshire, in 1782, educated at the prestigious Phillips Exeter Academy, which at that time was free to attend with the aims to teach young men in the great end and real business of living, to regulate the tempers, enlarge the minds, and form the morals of the youth. His father was an Army officer who was relocated to Wilmington, Delaware, and then Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, where he worked as a recruiter. In 1801, he resigned his commission and moved the family to Marietta, Ohio, where he and his sons built a cabin for the family. After arriving in Ohio, Cass embarked on a career of law, joining the practice of Return Jonathan Meigs. It is here that we begin to see a division between Cass and his father, who was an ardent Federalist. Cass was becoming entranced with the political direction of Thomas Jefferson, which had much appeal to the younger generation. In 1806, he was elected to the Ohio House of Representatives. In 1807, named the U.S. Marshal for Ohio. When hostilities with Britain commenced in 1812, Cass was appointed the commander of the 3rd Ohio Regiment, which soon saw action along the U.S. and Canada border in the Michigan Territory. William Hull, the governor of the Michigan Territory and commander of Fort Detroit, and Cass's superior officer in rank, but not in military tactics. In fact, it would be Hull's lack of military experience and incompetence that would hand the fort to the British in 1812. Though Cass stood positioned to attack the enemy. Cass would return to Washington to tell the story to the Secretary of War and put the blame firmly on Hull. A year later, as the aide-de-camp to General William Henry Harrison at the Battle of the Thames on October 5th, 1813, with the recapture, you'll see this slide here, is of the killing of Tecumseh at that battle. And it was actually, this painting or drawing was done in honor of Cass. Now, Cass is not the guy doing the shooting there. Cass is one of the guys up in the corner on a horse. He was a brigadier general, and the two other gentlemen are Commodore Oliver Perry and General William Henry Harrison. With the recapture of the fort of Detroit, President James Madison appointed Cass the governor of the Michigan Territory on October 13, 1813. It was only 8 days later. Over the next 7 years, Cass worked to promote Michigan as a place of settlement for Easterners looking to move to the state. Myself. Though the Erie Canal would not open until 1825, there was a growing desire for land that had been off limits before the American Revolution. This meant that treaties had to be signed with various Native American tribes in the region. By the end of the decade, Cass was tasked with managing a massive territory encompassing all of the lower and upper peninsula of Michigan, Wisconsin, and northern Minnesota. There were only 8,900 people living in the region, mostly comprising of the members of the many indigenous tribes across the territory, including the Odawa, Ojibwa, Potawatomi, Menominee, Winnebago, Ho-Chunk, Dakota, and others. He managed it from his 500-acre farm in Detroit that fronted the Detroit River. He had several servants, including a slave named Sally. He also had a servant named Jeremiah Gazelle, who apparently was a fugitive slave that Cass apparently assisted with buying his freedom. By 1819, Cass had been administered an increasingly large territory, most of which he had not visited. After the creation of the states of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, the remaining part of the Northwest Ordinance was designated the Michigan Territory. However, most of it was still populated and controlled by the various indigenous tribes of the region, which had stronger ties to British Canada. With statehood already on his mind and that of many of Michigan's growing populace, he saw a need to gain not only greater knowledge of the extent and the makeup of the territory, but pave the way for expansion. On November 18, 1819, Cass wrote to the Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, to request support for an expedition to the Lake Superior region the following summer. And then later, he laid out the following objectives. 1, a personal examination of the different Indian tribes who occupy the country, of their moral and social condition, of their feelings towards the United States, and of their numerical strength. 2, to procure the extinction of titles to the land in the vicinity of Sault Ste. Marie, Prairie du Chien, and Green Bay. 3, an examination of the body of copper in the vicinity of Lake Superior. 4, to ascertain the views of the Indians in the vicinity of Chicago respecting the removal of the Six Nations to that district of the country. 5, to explain to the Indians the views of the government respecting their intercourse with British authorities at Malden, and distinctly to announce to them that their visits must be discontinued. And 10, to ascertain the state of the British fur trade within that part of our jurisdiction. He concluded stating that it is very important to carry the flag of the United States into those remote regions where it has never been borne by a person in a public station. On January 14th, Calhoun wrote back stating that he supported the expedition, and Cass spent the winter planning his route, ordering supplies, and building his team to make this arduous journey. With the support of the War Department, which in the early 19th century was in charge of Indian affairs, and the reason why is rather than being run by the Secretary of State, the tribes were not seen as sovereign nations. They were seen as largely combatants and enemies to some extent. So that's why the Secretary of War was in charge of the Indian affairs. Cass began planning the expedition. The key element was transportation. And though sailing vessels were now common on the lower Great Lakes, canoes were chosen as the mode of transportation. Because the goal was better to understand the landscape and the geology of the region, canoes would allow for better access to the shoreline for study. Also, they would need to travel up rivers as well, which wouldn't be navigable by boat. Cass ordered 3 canoes from the Saginaw Band of Ojibwa Indians for a May launch. These were large Montreal canoes using a wood frame, birch bark exterior, 36 feet in length and 6 feet in width. This is the one that we have on display in the exhibition, which is only 30 feet long. These canoes, fully loaded with crew and goods, could carry up to 4 tons of goods. However, this was not a trading expedition, so the main items that they needed to bring were food, shelter, weapons, scientific equipment. In addition, Cass brought goods not necessarily to trade, but to gift to Native American tribes and leaders that they met along the way. This is especially true for the treaty negotiations in Sault Ste. Marie and other places. Cass needed a large team to pull off such an ambitious expedition. First, he needed experienced canoers and guides who knew the routes and terrain, so he hired a group of 12 French voyageurs and 10 Anishinaabe, Ojibwa, Adawa, Potawatomi, and also some Shawnee to be the main paddlers. Because he was representing not only the Michigan Territory but the U.S. government, he was authorized to recruit 7 soldiers from Fort Detroit that joined the party as well. Because of the main purpose of the expedition was to assess the landscape and mineral resources, Cass needed both a mineralogist and also a topographer. Henry Schoolcraft had already distinguished himself in his survey of Arkansas and was selected by Calhoun. David Bates Douglas was an instructor at West Point and was given the leave of absence to study the landscape, navigate, and also be an engineer. And other people, Dr. Alexander Walcott, who was a physician, later became, I think, the mayor of Detroit. James Doty was the official secretary. He went on to become, I think, the territorial governor of Wisconsin and then Utah. Charles Trowbridge became a major player in Detroit, but also Trowbridge Park in Marquette is named for Trowbridge. So Henry Rose Schoolcraft was born in Guilderland, New York in 1793. He entered Union College at the age of 15 and then Middlebury College. He worked at his father's trade as a glassmaker but had a deep interest in geology and mineralogy. At the age of 25, he left home to explore the West. In 1818 and 19, along with Levi Pettibone, he conducted the survey work in the Missouri and Arkansas and identified lead deposits and then published his report, A View of the Lead Mines of Missouri. This brought him attention from the Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, who suggested him as the mineralogist for the expedition. Now, I'm not going to go into a great deal of depth about the expedition because you can go see that at the exhibit at the Beaumier Center. But this is a famous painting actually done much later than 1820. This was done in the 1850s by Francis Hopkins in Canada of an excursion. So even then they did like excursion trips for tourists in Voyager canoes. But this would give you an idea of what it would have been like with the paddlers and then the leaders of the expedition not paddling in the middle of the boat. So they left Detroit, went up the coast of Lake Huron, which Schoolcraft himself became bored with because it doesn't really change much. There's no real major rock formations other than the Turnip Rock at the tip of the mitten. And other than that, it was pretty boring. And by the time they got to Mackinac, they were really happy. Interesting enough that Mackinac, this is not a painting, it was done right around that time, it's not a painting of the expedition. At Mackinac at that time, there were ships, so they were resupplied by ships at Mackinac. The reason they were in the canoes is because they had to go along the shoreline to do their study of the topography and the mineralogy, and to meet the Native Americans along the way. They then traveled up to Sault Ste. Marie, up the St. Mary's River. One of the things that they did discover in this region was the great deposits of gypsum and limestone, which would become incredibly important later in the iron ore industry because they were key to the smelting process. And that's why to this day we still have dolomite and limestone mines and quarries in the eastern Upper Peninsula. This is a drawing by Henry Schoolcraft. It was put into his journals that he published in 1821 of Sault Ste. Marie. Again, he was neither the first nor the last to exaggerate the height of the mountains in Canada. But it is still a great image in itself. This was an incredibly important stop along the way, and was really the only contentious thing that happened in their journey that I could find. Cass's task when they went to Sault Ste. Marie was to sign a treaty with the tribes there to basically get a large portion of land along the river. And the whole point of it was to be able to build Fort Brady or a fort there and have a military presence. And everything would happen, of course, later on also to make sure that trade was flowing through, in particular when the copper mines opened up and then the Sioux Locks eventually. His the person who was negotiating largely was Shingabawasan, who's there wearing one of the medals that he received from one of the presidents of the United States, because he signed many different peace treaties, and they would get these medals of the president of the United States that they signed a treaty with. And Shingabawasan was the leader of the tribe there, but there was also another group there that had a more younger group who were very much against signing anything away. Shingabawasan wasn't sure himself. He was a little bit concerned. Their main concern was not necessarily the land. Their concern was, if all these soldiers and Americans are coming here, what are they going to do to our people? They were worried about the security of their people. In the end, the other leader of the tribe or the band basically walked away from negotiations, went back to his wigwam, and raised a British flag. Cass walked over, took the flag down, and took it away, and they prepared for battle. But both Jane Johnston, Schoolcraft's mother, Susan Johnston, and her brother, I think it was Jim Johnston or Jack Johnston, went over and basically stopped any type of violence happening, and they renegotiated. And in the process, the United States government got a much smaller parcel of land to build a fort. They also gave up or allowed the rights of Native Americans to continue to fish and hunt in the area. This is incredibly important because to this very day, that's still used as a precedent with the Sioux tribes and many tribes for treaties that later were signed and then reneged on, because those rights were taken away by states and by the federal government in some cases. They traveled to Grand Island and they were much impressed, of course, by the pictured rocks. Stopped in Grand Island and were much celebrated by the Native Americans who were there. They had a big celebration for them. It was at this time that Schoolcraft, now this is going to be interesting, because Schoolcraft is going to make his name writing about Native American culture, storytelling, their history. He writes in his journal at this event how bored he is. He says, they're dancing and they're singing these songs forever, and we have to pretend like we're enjoying it. I think it says a lot about Schoolcraft, because, as I'll talk a little bit about later, that, it's not that he's in love with this stuff. He sees an opportunity. And that, in many ways, his character and Cass's are much the same way. These are very ambitious people. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Here's a picture of the Pitcher Rocks done by Schoolcraft. They then went up from Grand Island along the lake. They camped at not what is Granite Point now, but Little Presque Isle in Marquette. And then did the portage, which was a river at that time, not just a canal, to Lake Superior and down to Ontonagon. This is actually Schoolcraft's drawing of the rock formations at Little Presque. So in Ontonagon, they had heard about this huge piece of native copper that one could see. In fact, I like to call what is now called the Ontonagon Boulder, I like to call it the wall drug of Lake Superior at that time. If you traveled along Lake Superior, you had to stop and see the Ontonagon Boulder because it was the largest piece of copper that anyone had ever seen, pure copper. And so Schoolcraft, actually several of the people in the expedition headed up the Ontonagon River. This was quite an arduous trip at the time with Indian guides and were led to the boulder. Cass didn't make it all the way. They got to a point where they had to hike up hills and he just couldn't do it physically. And so he stayed back with the party and the canoes, and a few canoes made it to the expedition. And this is Schoolcraft's depiction of the actual boulder. He lied. It's nowhere near this big. He even comments in his journal how disappointed he was with the size of it. And it had been gouged out by previous visitors and carved up. And so it wasn't nearly as big. He created this picture basically to spur interest in the region. That if they were pieces of copper this big, people wanted to go there. So that is why he made it so big, but he himself even said it was much smaller than that. This is going to be a very important thing later because to this very day, the Ontonagon Boulder is still a contentious issue with the Keweenaw Bay Indian community and the Smithsonian Institution, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. From Ontonagon, they headed to the Lakehead or Fond du Lac, where Duluth is now, and then traveled inland up to what we now call Cass Lake. It was called Red Cedar Lake by the Native Americans. And at that point, which is that far northwest part of the map, they decided that this was the source of the Mississippi, even though Schoolcraft had his doubts and would later go back in 1832 to prove otherwise. And then traveled back down the Mississippi to Minneapolis, where they met with tribal groups, and then to Prairie du Chien at the mouth of the Wisconsin River, and then up to Green Bay, to Lake Michigan, and back to Detroit. All in 5 months by canoe. Approximately 4,000 miles, visiting Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, dozens of rivers, including the Mississippi, Wisconsin, Fox, St. Louis, and St. Mary's River. This is another painting by Frances Ann Hopkins from Canada at a later date. So what happens afterwards? Well, first of all, think of it, the Erie Canal opens in 1825. Michigan's population in 1820 is just under 9,000. By 1830, it's 32,000. By 1840, it's 212,000. There is a huge increase in demand for land and places for Americans to live. So this is one of the first things that happens. Lewis Cass would travel back up to the upper and western Great Lakes several times to pursue his ultimate goal for the U.S. government and Michigan Territory, the acquisition of land through treaties with the Native Americans. Get my clock here. Sorry. Okay. In 1822 or 1825, the Erie Canal opened, and soon a rush of migrants from northeastern U.S. were looking to settle. In 1821, the Treaty of Chicago, which was negotiated by Cass, and the U.S. acquired a large L-shaped tract of land, which is now southwest Michigan. In 1825, Cass returned to Prairie du Chien to achieve what he began in 1820, renegotiating a lasting peace and delineate boundaries between the regional tribes. The treaty was signed by U.S. officials and representatives of the Sioux, Ojibwa, Sauk, Fox, Illinois, Menominee, Iowa, Winnebago, Ottawa, and Potawatomi tribes. By doing so, Cass would now be able to negotiate with each individual tribe for lands that the United States wanted to acquire. A year later, Cass would return to Lake Superior and negotiate a treaty with the various Ojibwa tribes at Fond du Lac along the St. Louis River. Representatives from the following bands attended and signed the eventual treaty: the St. Mary Sioux, St. Croix, Le Pointe, Lac Coudray, Lac de Flambeau, Ontonagon, Vermilion Lake, Snake River, Rainy Lake, Sandy Lake, Fond du Lac, and the Crow Wing rivers of the Ojibwa people. Article 3 of that treaty stated that the Chippewa tribe grant to the government of the United States the right to search for and carry away any metals or minerals from any part of their country. But this grant is not to affect the title of the land nor the jurisdiction over it. So at this point, they weren't saying that the United States now was in jurisdiction of the land or taking it away. They just wanted the mineral rights. And that should tell you where their whole thought process was at that time. Now, along with Cass in 1826 was the Secretary of Indian Affairs, Thomas McKenney. During the treaty, a band leader named Jichishkinwen stated, "There is a rock there. I met some of your people in the search of it. I told them if they took to steal it, not to let me catch them." Another Ontonagon band later said, "On the subject of the rock, the Father's is the property of no one man. It belongs to us all. It was put there by the Great Spirit, and it is ours." During this time at Fond du Lac, McKenney was visited by an Ojibwa who was looking for Cass. He was deeply impoverished and forlorn in his looks. It was Washpekabins, who was the same man who had led Cass and the party to the expedition Ontonagon Boulder 6 years earlier. He told Cass and McKenney that he had been cast off by the band because they believed he had offended the Great Spirit by showing the expedition the way to the boulder. He had since suffered much hardship, which he took as confirmation of his offense. With the treaty signed, McKenney returned to Washington but hired a party of 25 men to try and remove the Ontonagon Boulder, now that the United States could claim it as its own. They were unsuccessful, even though they built a fire on top of it to try and soften it to be broken up into pieces. The boulder was finally removed in 1843 by a crew hired by Julius Eldred, who had bought it for $150. And many scholars believe that the only reason the tribe sold it to him, or the leader sold it to him, was because they didn't think he'd be successful in moving it. Unfortunately, he was. And this is a sign at the reservoir in Victoria, the Victoria Reservoir, where the Ontonagon Boulder would have lain. It's all underwater now. And the actual boulder itself at the Smithsonian Institution, which is now on display between two elevators because that's the only part of the building strong enough to hold it. So that's just as big as it is. Compare that to Schoolcraft's depiction. By 1831, Cass was a highly regarded territorial governor, but after 18 years in the post, his ambitions were pushing him towards more power and status. He had embraced the policy of relocation of Indian tribes to the west of the Mississippi River because he believed that it was impossible for American settlers and Indians to live in peace if the tribes insisted on governing themselves. In his mind, he was trying to protect the future Indian tribes, but also believed, what Indian has ever been injured by the laws of any state? We asked the question without any fear of answer. If these Indians are too ignorant and barbarous to submit to state laws or duly estimate their value, they are too ignorant and barbarous to establish and maintain a government which shall protect its own citizens and preserve the necessary relationship and intercourse with its neighbors. Such beliefs put him in good graces with President Andrew Jackson, and on August 1st, 1831, he was appointed the new Secretary of War, which gave him jurisdiction over all of Indian affairs. It now fell on him to administer the policies of the Indian Removal Act that was signed into law in 1830. During his tenure, he oversaw the removal of the Seminole and Creek people to Oklahoma as part of the Trail of Tears, and also some from the Great Lakes region. And this is just some of the people in the trails that were taken to west of the Mississippi. He believed, and many people believed, that this was good. Put them out there because no one's going to want to move out there. No Americans want to going to move into those prairies. There's nothing there. They were so naive about what was going to happen in the coming decades. In 1835 and 1836, a new treaty was being negotiated for the acquisition of the northwest part of the Lower Peninsula and the eastern half of the Upper Peninsula with the Odawa and Ojibwa. Leaders amongst the tribes, in particular the interpreter Augustine Hamlin, implored Cass to not remove the tribes from Michigan. When the Treaty of Washington of 1836 was signed, reservations were created for the tribes to live on until time of relocation. These reservations still exist to this day, and it's probably due to their relationship with Cass and also Schoolcraft that they were able to secure their permanence in the region. With his return to Detroit, Schoolcraft began working on writing his journal about the expedition, and by 1821 he had completed and published the narrative journal of travels from Detroit northwest to the great chain of American lakes to the sources of the Mississippi River in the year of 1820. Whew, that was the title. The book was a great success and elevated Schoolcraft's status as a geologist and explorer. By 1820, Cass was greatly impressed by Schoolcraft, and on their journey named him the Indian agent for the Michigan Territory. He traveled to Sault Ste. Marie to act as his base of operations. It was there he was reacquainted with the Johnston family, who he had met briefly during the earlier visit, and was invited to live with them. During the following winter, a romance grew between him and Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, who was known by her Anishinaabe name, Women of the Sound Rushing Through the Sky. They were soon married, and this created for Schoolcraft an important connection to her Anishinaabe family, clan, and band. From Jane, a poet in her own right, and her mother Susan, whose name translated into Women of the Green Glade, Schoolcraft began collecting Ojibwa and Odawa stories, and soon began publishing a magazine, The Literary Voyager, and then books compiling these stories. He is considered many the father of American ethnology for these collections, and they heavily influenced Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha. However, one of his most lasting legacies was his role as an Indian agent, where he worked to pave the way for the acquisition of tribal lands for the United States. The most important of these was the Treaty of Washington in 1836, which was the culmination of years of developing relations with the regional tribes. Comprising of the northwest third of the Lower Peninsula and eastern half of the UP, this was the largest treaty acquisition in the state and was crucial to Michigan, which would be granted statehood in early 1837. In 1841, he was dismissed as the northern agent by the new administration of William Henry Harrison, his old commander, a former military colleague of his, and this was for political purposes because he was in a different political party. He would go on to continue publishing his research and memoirs before dying in 1864 at the age of 71. Also, before he left office or left as this agent, he was tasked by the Territory of Michigan to actually name many of the counties, or it was the state of Michigan at the time, to name many of the northern counties, which he did, naming them after Native American leaders who he had worked with and knew, but also making up names. He loved making up his own type of names based on some mythological ideal, and so a lot of them were named by him, and then later were changed by opponents of Schoolcraft, so they would change over time. I did a presentation about this at the Sonderegger, I think 3 years ago. You can go online at our website and watch that presentation if you want to know more about it. With the opening of the first shipping lock in Sault Ste. Marie, 1855, commercial shipping of copper, iron, and lumber became viable. Though these goods were already being shipped, it was a costly process as goods had to be unloaded and then transported by rail or barge to Sault Ste. Marie to a waiting ship, or in some cases, the entire ship was portaged through town. With the opening of the locks, and time and money were saved, and this opened the region's natural resources to greater exploration. This is a very early photograph of the first lock, and on the right is the Native American fishing village, which they were able to build because of the Treaty of 1820, and later was removed when they needed to build new locks. The U.S. government removed them. This led to a boom of mines along the spine of the Keweenaw and Marquette Iron Range. But the locks also brought people to the Lake Superior region to settle and work in the new towns popping up along the shore and inland. With the development of the mines and towns, there was an increased need for lumber, which was in great supply everywhere they looked. As the cities of the Midwest grew, the UP forest began to disappear as the need for lumber grew with each passing year. By the beginning of the 20th century, the landscape of the Upper Peninsula was greatly altered. Its pine forests had largely been decimated, and the hardwoods would soon follow. Mining districts are greatly profitable, but were barren landscapes punctuated by small towns, neighborhoods, and trailing ponds or tailing piles. Along the shore of Lake Superior sprung lumber mills, stamping mills, pig iron smelters, manufacturing plants for everything from industrial chemicals to leather tanneries. Cass's accomplishments as the Michigan territorial governor set the region on the course of statehood, but it also helped him accomplish what he wished for most, higher office. He was a deeply ambitious man who saw his public service as an avenue to greatness. After serving as the Secretary of War until 1836, he was appointed the ambassador to France by President Jackson. He returned home in 1842 and ran unsuccessfully to be the Democratic candidate for president in 1848. In 1845, he was appointed the U.S. Senator for Michigan by the State House. His platform was dominated by his belief that it should be the citizens, not the federal government, that should permit slavery in a particular state or territory. And this is what he coined as popular sovereignty, which was the belief that it should be up to the territories and states to determine whether they should have slaves. Leave it to the people who will be affected by this question to adjust it upon their own responsibility, and we shall render another tribute to the principles of our government, furnish another guarantee for its permanence and prosperity. This is an example of his writing. He writes around issues like no one else. He wrote a 50-page speech that could have been reduced to like 5 pages because he never wants to get to the point. He wants to go around it and then finally come to the point, but also never to really put his feelings on the line. He was a great appeaser, and that was how he became known, not a compromiser, but as an appeaser, to say, I don't want to ruffle any feathers. And so that's why he supported the idea that states should determine whether they have slaves or not. As I said about Schoolcraft, he went on to become the superintendent of Indian Affairs, but then was taken out of office. From that point on, he really focused on his writing career and being a literary individual. And we're going to learn more about his relationship with Jane Johnston's Schoolcraft in just a few minutes, so I'm not going to go into that. This is the Native Americans fishing on the St. Mary's River, as the Treaty of 1820 stated they would be able to do so, even though there were many times when they were prevented from doing so, including the destruction of their village. I think it's really important to think about what happened to many of the people who Cass relocated. This is a group of Potawatomi who had been relocated from Michigan and who were sent to Kansas to live on a farm. And this is a picture of their home. It looks like they're being fairly prosperous, but this is not their home. And across the plains are these tribes that all came from the eastern United States, including parts of Wisconsin and Michigan, Minnesota. And this is just an example of Cass's work. And probably the most prominent, the young man asked earlier about the religious aspects, where Cass was not so interested in that. Later on in the 19th century, it was American policy to re-educate and Americanize the youth of Native American youth through the boarding school system. This is the school in Mount Pleasant. In the end, one might ask, how should we celebrate and remember these two individuals? Are they heroes to be celebrated? Should we judge their actions and attitudes by today's standards? It is easy to say that they were just men of their time and did what any white man would have done at that time. In truth, that's not exactly true. One of the great American folk heroes of the early 19th century, Davy Crockett, himself a U.S. representative, opposed the relocation of indigenous tribes from the East. With regards to slavery, Cass himself was at odds with an insurgent abolitionist movement for political expedience, and certainly not on the right side of history. As for Schoolcraft, his work as an Indian agent, as benevolent as he may have thought he was being, would have lasting ramifications for the indigenous people of the Great Lakes. His appropriation of Anishinaabe culture for his own self-aggrandizement certainly was in step with his times, but shows that his ambitions far outweighed his sensitivity to others, including his often abandoned spouse. In the end, what I believe we should judge about these two men are their motivations, which were not altruistic or for the greater glory of their country and state. They were driven by their own insatiable desire for greatness, power, and vainglory. And I believe we are seeing that now. The state office building that was named for Cass was renamed in 2020 for civil rights leaders Daisy Elliott and Melvin Larson. And to this day, Cass's statue still represents the state of Michigan in Statuary Hall. It's not the only statue that could be called into question. There are also Native Americans who are represented there and various individuals, including civil rights leaders. But Cass still represents the state of Michigan. And so with that, I'm going to leave it, and I'm going to open it up if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask. And I'm going to pass the mic. You can pass it on to the next person.
On your map that showed the route of the Cass expedition,
Yes.
Isle Royal was circled. Did they go there?
No, they did not. The thing about that map is that Schoolcraft wrote that this was drawn by him. He had to have based it on a lot of other maps because he didn't go to most of the places. So he must have used earlier maps and then drew the route along that map. He wasn't a map maker himself. An interesting thing is that there's another big island in Lake Superior called Isle Philippo that's on that map. It doesn't exist. Now, this is not uncommon for some of the early maps. That early Jesuit map was incredibly well accurate, but many other later maps would be very inaccurate, and they would invent things, mountain ranges, islands, all sorts of things that didn't actually exist. So Schoolcraft just used somebody else's map, really, and just plotted the route along it. Are there any other questions? Fred over there has a question.
So I was curious about your population. You had mentioned that there was around 9,000 people, I guess, 9,000 in 1920, I think. How many, that I presume that did not include the Native Americans? And could you talk a little bit about how many Native Americans there were?
No, it did include the Native Americans. Yeah, they had done a survey. And because there were people out there, and so they had done a survey, and they believed that there were, but there probably were a lot more Native Americans in the region at that time.
I was going to say that must have
But
been
it did
enough.
include Native Americans, as many as they knew. So yeah, it was indigenous people, but there at that time, the Americans and the Europeans that were in the region were largely in Detroit or at one of the forts that were located, or fur trading posts that were located. So that was where the main population was being. Many of them were soldiers or fur traders.
Well, I guess part of my interest in that was, there's been a lot written about how dramatically the Native American population was reduced by the epidemics when Europeans first came to the East Coast. But I've not heard how much the population had changed in the upper Midwest among the indigenous people because of those European diseases that were brought in probably a couple of centuries earlier. But
And actually even very recent at that time, and Marty Reinhardt, who's going to be speaking later, I think can speak to that more directly. But yeah, no, there were many instances in the 1600s and 1700s of large-scale disease killing many people in the upper Great Lakes, and probably preceded even Europeans coming here because those diseases spread it very quickly. into across the continent after Europeans came to the East Coast.
One of your earlier slides listing the participants in the Cass expedition,
Yeah.
you mentioned Native American paddlers, but also a dozen voyageurs. Were those voyageurs French-Canadian descendants of voyageurs that settled in what is now Michigan and who had previously paddled that area?
Absolutely. They were all based in Detroit, as far as we know, because that's where Cass planned his expedition and recruited. And there were a lot of voyageurs living there at that time because the fur trade was still very active. And Detroit was a really important center in the fur trade and settlement in general. And so there were a lot of voyageurs living there who were descendants of earlier voyageurs living there since Detroit was founded as a fur trading post and a fort in the early 1700s by Cadillac. And so there was a long history of voyageurs living there. And some of them, there were British voyageurs as well, but they were primarily up in the north as part of the Hudson Bay Company. Actually, later today, Dr. Sebastian Millette is going to be talking about the Métis voyager culture, and he can speak a little bit more about that. Yeah, go ahead, Russ.
While I have the microphone, when you talk about the Indian population, and I think it's Schoolcraft that points out, or it doesn't matter if he did or didn't, a lot of times the census taker would visit a village, but the male population might be out hunting at some other location. And so they were getting a very limited number of people. That's one thing. The other thing you talk about, the smallpox epidemic, during the French and Indian War, the English sent out blankets that had been infected with smallpox. Smallpox kind of comes off as crusts, and so they put it in the blankets and then pass them out. And we do have, there's an article that talks about that and the number of Indians. It wasn't hundreds, but there were a number of Indians around the eastern Upper Peninsula that were infected by the smallpox and died. And that's only from the church records that we have the information. There were obviously a lot more. Yeah.
Right. Are there any other questions?
With the 5-month expedition that you're talking about, and you mentioned that they were having food supplies shipped along, but they also did a lot of hunting. I was just curious, what kind of food did they take with them, and how much did they depend on their own food, and how much on hunting and other supplies along the way?
They actually, basically, their diet was based entirely on what they could bring. They didn't really have time to hunt and fish. They were so busy getting to the next place. And occasionally, if they couldn't travel due to weather, they would try to hunt, but they usually talk about being very unsuccessful. They weren't very successful at it. Their diet would have primarily been of dried goods, things such as peas or beans and salt pork, which were really the standard fare for traveling parties like this on canoes going back to the 1600s. In fact, the voyageurs who paddled from Montreal to the Lake Superior region were called the mangeurs de lard. They were the pork eaters because they ate salt pork pretty much their entire travels. And so I think that would have been a standard part of their diet, would have been, and probably flour for biscuits or some type of hardtack or something of that nature. That was primarily their diet, and also probably what the Native Americans would provide them. They would pick up supplies at the different forts and trading posts that they went to along the way as well. All right, well, we need to make time to get Sarah Daniels up here, so thank you. If you have any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them later or at lunchtime or something. Thank you very much.